Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees Mogg about the topics of the day.
Welcome to another edition of the Moggcast. This is Paul Goodman, editor of Conservative Home, in conversation with Jacob Rees Mogg. And guess what? We're going to be talking again about Brexit. And let's start with some of the immediate procedural questions before us. Do you think there'll be a vote tomorrow night, as promised, which is a meaningful vote?
I'm sure there will be a vote tomorrow as promised. Whether it is meaningful in terms of the act or is meaningful in another way, I'm not certain.
I mean, just what was promised was a meaningful vote in terms of the act.
Was it promised that specifically? That what was promised was that the government would go back to the EU, that it would have a negotiation and that it would bring back what it had to present to Parliament. If nothing has changed, then it would be a discourtesy to Parliament to ask it to vote on something that it had rejected by a majority of 230, and I'm sure the government wouldn't wish to be a discourtesy to Parliament. I think she
promised a meaningful vote tomorrow evening. That's this evening as the listeners are hearing this Moggcast. But of course this leads to the next question, which is, you're clearly of the view that if she's got nothing new to put, there shouldn't be a meaningful vote under the terms of the Act.
Well, and indeed under normal parliamentary procedure, that the same question can't be put twice in a session in usual circumstances. It is not an absolute hard and fast rule, but it is a usual rule to stop parliamentary time being wasted. If the deal is unchanged, who is going to vote for it who voted against it last time?
Could you raise a point on this? Surely even the government's position is that it doesn't want to put the deal in the same terms as last time, because between last time and this time, if there is a this time, has come the Brady Amendment and the Malthouse Compromise. And the Brady Amendment proposed taking out the backstop entirely and was supported by the government. You were all whipped to vote for it. So the government's own position, surely, is that the deal it put last time is defective.
That's absolutely correct. That is the position of Her Majesty's government. So why would it put back a deal that the government itself thinks is no good?
And there's no indication, of course our listeners may know better by tomorrow morning, but there's no indication, is there, that the Attorney General is prepared to change his mind and give legal advice about the backstop, contrary to the advice he's already given?
I mean, I wouldn't want to guess at what the Attorney General's going to say. You never know with these things. So much of it is in expectation management, and you lower expectations and then you come up with something mild which wouldn't have been satisfactory if expectations hadn't been managed. We're in that sort of category, except all the indications are that there is no rabbit to be brought out of the hat, and that this isn't expectation management, it is the genuine position. I may be wrong, I wouldn't be sorry if I were wrong, but that's what it looks like.
You favour a vote tomorrow evening on what?
Well, what I would be very tempted to do in the government's position is to bring forward the second reading of the Wade bill and have a vote on that, and wrap the meaningful vote up in that, but promise in the Wade bill to put into UK law our own end date.
Do you think it might do that?
Oh, I'd be very surprised if it did, but that's just my personal thought as to what it would be sensible to do, and to take the commitments given in the letter provided by the EU in January and turn them into domestic UK law. And say, okay, this is what you've said this is your understanding of the legal position, thank you very much, we're putting it in domestic UK law, and that is the basis on which we are ratifying the treaty. Do you accept this as ratification or not?
It's interesting you suggest bringing forward a bill tomorrow night, because there is, I think, an issue of trust here. The government could, tomorrow night, not bring forward a meaningful vote under the terms of the Act. But it could put something forward again that would be rather like the Brady Amendment. If it did that, what I'm hearing from a lot of your colleagues is, oh no, we've been down this route before. We all voted for the Brady Amendment. We all, or most of us, supported the Malthouse Compromise. And the government didn't really push either very energetically.
The Malthouse Compromise is, I think, still a very sensible route, but now possibly on Malthouse B rather than Malthouse A. That is to say, a standstill period that we would pay for that would allow the future relationship to be negotiated over the next 21 months. I think that it would be a sensible thing for the government to adopt, and may even be a sensible thing for the government to bring forward tomorrow. It's very difficult to know how strongly the government pushes for things in Brussels, that one only hears selective rumours and briefings and gossip, and therefore I'm reluctant to say the government hasn't pushed it, because I don't know, and very few of the people who say one thing or another actually know how these negotiations have been conducted.
Let's think about all this in another way. I mean, the Prime Minister is in a very difficult position. Again and again, and you can argue either that she's in an unfortunate situation and that what's happened is not her fault, or you can argue that she's weak and has brought a lot of her problems on herself. But either way, there's a sense that the coherence of the government is running down, with pro-Remain or soft Brexit ministers in the government having openly defied the policy on no deal. Now, do you think in Downing Street they're sitting there almost afraid to move? If they don't pull this vote, they face the prospect of a massive destabilising defeat along the same lines as the last one. If they do pull it, it could be read as a sign they've reached the end of the road and total paralysis, and the Prime Minister's position then comes under question again. Do you think they're thinking anything like that?
I think the breakdown in the constitutional norms is a real problem for the Prime Minister. And there are two norms that have been broken. One is the relationship between the executive and the legislature. And this is under daily attack at the moment. And the government has had to fight very hard to keep control of the basic relationship that guides the two. And that's very unfortunate, because our system of government does not work if there is not a separation of powers and if there isn't an understanding as who does what bit. And essentially a government in which you have confidence proposes the legislation that is considered, and Parliament is there to seek redress of grievance and hold the government to account. It is not there to be the government, even though the government is drawn from it. The second bit of the Constitution that's under attack is collective responsibility. And if you're a PPS who supports government policy, you get fired. And if you're a cabinet minister who opposes government policy in a newspaper, you remain in office. This is
you're referring to Alberto Costa.
I am indeed, yes, who I was very pleased to support in his motion. I think my name was immediately after Jeremy Corbyn's on the order paper, which is an unusual place for it to be. But I was delighted to be there. So I think that breakdown in collective responsibility is a constitutional problem, and it makes it very difficult for the government to have a collective agreed position that determines events. On the other hand, it doesn't particularly challenge the Prime Minister's position, because the whole cabinet hasn't come together with a different view. It's just bits of the cabinet who have a different view. And in the absence of the whole cabinet coming together, it's hard to see how her position is challenged. Also, constitutionally, the Prime Minister's won a vote of confidence as leader of her party. She's won a vote of confidence as Prime Minister. If the cabinet were to say, we don't back you, she could just replace them.
I think you're basically suggesting that all this excitable stuff in the papers this weekend about the Prime Minister being gone more or less forthwith is unlikely to happen, because it would require a united cabinet to do it, and we don't have a united cabinet that will do it.
So 4 cabinet ministers go, they get replaced. 10 cabinet ministers go, they get replaced. The cabinet is not coming to the I am Spartacus moment, I don't think.
Isn't there a question of numbers? I mean, you can replace 1 or 2 at a time. You probably couldn't replace 10.
Well, Jeremy Corbyn showed that you could...
Jeremy Corbyn had the support of the members. It's not entirely clear that the Prime Minister does.
No, I accept that, but he was able to replace almost all his shadow cabinet and had some very interesting appointments, as in the late Paul Flynn, who I think was on the front bench at an age only rivalled by Gladstone in modern British political history.
Do you think there's any chance, if there is a vote on the deal that's a meaningful vote under the terms of the Act, and the deal is voted down, that the proposed votes on Wednesday and Thursday are then pulled? The votes on no deal and extension, respectively.
Well, if a motion is passed on Tuesday, then there aren't votes on Wednesday and Thursday. It's only if a vote is defeated.
It isn't.
So if a Brady-style motion were put forward and that were passed, then it would be hard to see how you could keep the commitment on Wednesday and Thursday because something had been passed.
Ah, you're suggesting that we'll keep calling it a Brady-type motion. It's
Why not?
passed tomorrow, rather than a meaningful vote under the terms of the Withdrawal Act. If you're suggesting that that's then passed, you think the government's then in a position to pull the votes on no deal and extension? Your argument is it's been passed, so you don't need them anymore.
That's right. The government has got a version of a meaningful vote through.
But since the motion tonight, as the listeners listen, is amendable, the ERG, Oliver Letwin, Jeremy Corbyn, Yvette Cooper and all will have foreseen this, and there will be a blizzard of amendments to the motion tomorrow night seeking to head these possibilities off.
Yes, absolutely. That's right. And the question is, do they then pass? How do they pass? But it's a different balance, isn't it?
So actually, even if these votes that are planned on Wednesday and Thursday on no deal and on extension respectively don't take place, on Tuesday night,
you'll have something similar instead.
You and your colleagues could find yourself voting on the whole lot. Do you think there's any possibility, I tried exploring all this on Con Home on Sunday morning, that the Commons could pass amendments that are at least in tension and at most absolutely contradictory? I mean, after all, last time round or recently, the Commons passed both the Brady Amendment and the Spellman Amendment, which were not exactly on the same page.
That's absolutely right, yes. This is why you can't have Parliament pretending it's the government, because the government has to present a coherent programme to Parliament, which Parliament accepts or rejects. Once Parliament decides what its programme is, you have sort of Venn diagrams of agreement, and you find that things that don't in themselves make sense together have sufficient support within Parliament to be passed, and therefore you pass contradictory or at least semi-contradictory things.
Let's get off the procedure, because there's a danger of being lost in this forest. I mean, you won't be, but I will be, and at least some of the listeners
Your listeners are not lost by anything. It is the most high-powered listenership of any podcast organisation. I'm viewing you as a Conservative podcast organisation.
Some of them might not, nonetheless, be enjoying
They may be bored by what I'm saying, yes.
And by my questions. So actually, let's just stand back for a moment and imagine we have this deal before us, as it is, and just ask some simple questions about it. I mean, to you, it's still unsatisfactory, isn't it?
The deal?
Yes.
Yes. If the deal is unchanged and other things being equal, I'll vote against the deal tomorrow. But today is...
But you're well aware of the argument being put to you that is what I call part of the Prime Minister's chicken gate is, well, Jacob, you know, if you vote this deal down, you know where this is going. We'll get into extension. Once for an extension, Brexit will never happen. You'll have a second referendum. or you'll have Norway Plus. And rather than this deal, you're going to have those that are even worse. So you better take this deal now. That's our advice to you as a good friend. What do you say to all that?
The lines of Canning, aren't there, about the candid friend of thy wrath?
Save us
from the candid friend. I think the difficulty with that is actually quite fundamental, that there is an enormous disconnect between members of Parliament and the electorate, that we have a Remain Parliament and a Brexit electorate. I think if a Remain Parliament sabotages Brexit, that will do enormous damage to confidence, trust, faith in our democracy, and that will have electoral consequences for both the Labour Party and the Conservative Party. So I think the idea that vote down Mrs May's deal and then lo and behold we remain in the European Union is false. It is a false choice. It will not happen that way, because actually the politicians who speak with forked tongue and say that they want delay when they mean they want to stop us leaving don't have the courage to say they want to stop us leaving, because they know how unpopular it would be.
You think if in this imaginary world we go into extension, somehow no deal will still be there at the end of it, and that if Amber Rudd and company do what they've done before, the Prime Minister wouldn't roll over a second time?
I think the country at large expects us to leave on the 29th of March. I think it would be a great failure not to leave on the 29th of March. The only acceptable extension is for the legislative programme, and I think there would be justifiable irritation in the country at large if that didn't happen, and not just from people who voted leave, from people who voted remain but think that a democratic mandate ought to be implemented.
Is her deal in itself better than no Brexit at all?
I think you're offering me a false choice, but if that were the false choice, yes, I do think leaving is very important, because being legally out of the EU institutions is very important. And that is why, if the backstop were changed, I'm willing to accept the other terrible bits of the deal. It's not a good deal, even with the backstop amended, but because all of those run out after 21 months, that is worth doing for the legal certainty of being out of the European Union. The problem with the backstop is it has no end date.
But when push comes to shove, I think what you're saying is that even though her deal is better than remaining, if pro-Remain MPs are determined to have no Brexit or Norway Plus and kill the Brexit baby at birth, you will have no part in it. It's their responsibility.
It's the government's responsibility. Even if all the worst elements of Cooper Bell's let win pass, even if by law it is enacted that the government must ask for an extension, it is still in the government's hands to decide whether or not this extension happens, whether or not it lays the statutory instrument to implement it, how it asks for it in the European councils and is able to achieve it, and in the timetabling. Unless Parliament revokes the Withdrawal Act, it cannot stop us leaving on the 29th of March without the government's connivance. And to repeal the Withdrawal Act, I think, would still require the government's connivance.
What's your best bet of where we will be by the end of the week?
Where will we be? It's very hard to know. It is very hard to know day by day. I don't know what the motion will be for tomorrow. I don't know how that will be responded to on Wednesday and Thursday, if it is at all. I don't know if Geoffrey Cox will get anything from the European Union in the final 24 hours. So there is so little certainty that we could be leaving with an amended deal by the end of the week. We could have had Parliament vote for a delay, but that won't have been approved at that point. Or we could be heading towards leaving without a deal. All of these are possible.
Just finally, as an illustration of the pressures Downing Street is under, for better or worse, I've been told in the last 24 hours, if there are not free votes on no deal and extension, assuming we get there, which of course we may not, but if we do, if there are not free votes, pro-Remain ministers will resign. I've also been told if there are free votes, pro-Leave ministers will resign because they will regard the government as being in breach of its previous commitments to leave by allowing this vote on extension in the first place. So the government's caught either way on this free vote issue.
If everyone who ever threatened to resign did resign, then the world would be littered with resigned former cabinet ministers. Even with this government, even with its very high level of resignations, many more people have threatened to resign than actually have resigned. So I think in these circumstances one just has to wait and see, and the government has to decide, the Prime Minister has to decide, which side is bluffing, if either.
If you were the Prime Minister, what would you do?
I think Prime Ministers are at their strongest when they do what they're elected to do and what they have support in the country for doing and what they believe to be right. And to my mind, that is ensuring that we leave the EU on the 29th of March and using every constitutional measure to make that happen.
That would mean, in the event of these votes, whipping for no deal, would it not?
Well, that was the manifesto commitment. The government said that no deal is better than a bad deal. Parliament has said the current deal is a bad deal.
And if that failed, then whipping against extension.
Well, again, if I were advising, if I were to do this, I wouldn't have those votes on Wednesday and Thursday. I'd have a confidence vote on Wednesday. Does the House of Commons have confidence in the government? If it does, then the government must decide these things. If it doesn't, there must be a new government.
So, of course, confidence vote in the event of the government motion on Tuesday falling.
That's right, that's right. I think it'd be much better. I think it's the proper constitutional procedure and the government ought to stand up for the Constitution.
Do you think there's any prospect of that?
No, I hope it's extremely unlikely. But it's what the government... The government has all sorts of choices which it seems unwilling to make that would grasp back control. It seems far too much to be passive, responding to events, and almost overwhelmed by events. It needs to take the initiative, and how do you do that? Perhaps you introduce the second reading of the bill on Tuesday. Perhaps you say, if you lose the meaningful vote, we will have a vote of confidence, because you can always go from the lower to the higher. The vote of confidence trumps a vote on no deal, etc. And if you lose that, well, then you go to a general election. But ultimately, as a government, you've got to take that risk. It's a leasehold, not a freehold. You only govern with the confidence of the House of Commons. But the House of Commons has to understand the position too, that if it has confidence in the government, it has to allow the government to get major planks of its policy through. You cannot be in a position where you stop the government doing anything, but pretend you've got confidence in it.
Of course, some people, sorry to keep going, but some people would say that's exactly what the ERG has been doing.
No, we're completely supporting Conservative Party policy on which we stood for election in 2017, that we should be out of the customs union, out of the single market, that no deal's better than a bad deal, and we're committed unionists, so we believe in maintaining the United Kingdom. That this is all very middle of the road Conservative policy on which all the cabinet ministers who a week ago threatened that they would go off in a half accepted, because they were ministers of the Crown at the time. They didn't issue separate election addresses saying we only agree to this with our fingers crossed or any of that. They stood on that manifesto. We are sticking to it. They are not.
Well, there's much this week that could happen. There's doubtless much that should happen. We'll see in the next few days what will happen. In the meantime, Jacob, thank you very much.
It's as always a pleasure. Thank you.
The Moggcast, a fortnightly conversation with Jacob Rees Mogg about the topics of the day.